Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised. Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This episode is presented by Matt Fulton and produced by Chris Carr.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Secrets and Spies. Today, we're joined by another leading counterterrorism researcher, Aaron Zelin. Aaron has spent years studying the global jihadi movement, focusing on the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. In this episode, we'll explore the resurgence of the Islamic State following its territorial defeat in Iraq and Syria in 2017, and the evolving threat it poses to the United States and other countries. From recent attacks in Iran, Russia, and New Orleans, and the organizational restructuring that's made them rather resilient, we cover it all. Stay tuned as we unpack these critical issues with one of the foremost experts in the field. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy our conversation.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Aaron Zelin, welcome to Secrets and Spies. It's so good to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You are a well-known in counterterrorism spaces and have been for years. I'm sure there are plenty of listeners who are well acquainted with you already. For any who aren't, if you could just tell us a bit about you and your work.
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me. I'm a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, also a visiting research scholar at Brandeis University. I founded the website Jihadology, and, I focus on the global jihadi movement, essentially anything related to the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, as well as, groups that maybe aren't global jihad, but local jihadis like Taliban in Afghanistan or HTS in Syria. So just try and cover everything if I can.
So we are here to, talk about ISIS. I've wanted to get you on for a while, and I said to you when I reached out, in my head, it was sort of like, this year, okay, do I want to ask Aaron on to talk about HTS and Syria, or should we focus on ISIS? And then, of course, recent events of the last week or so sort of kind of made the decision for me. But yeah, so I wanted to discuss ISIS with you. We've had a range of attacks from them in the last year. I just want to go through a few major ones, sort of set the scene, and then I'll hand it over to you with a question. Starting in January, a bombing of a memorial service for Qasem Soleimani in Kerman, Iran, killed 103 people. In February, twin bombings in Balochistan the day before Pakistan's general elections killed 30. Later that month in Mozambique, ISIS militants murdered at least 26 people and left a note declaring war on Christians in the area. In March, an ISIS-linked ambush left 30 Nigerian soldiers dead. The next day, a bank in Kandahar was bombed in Afghanistan, killing another 20 people. Again, the next day after that, 4 ISIS gunmen from Tajikistan carried out a mass shooting and arson attack at a concert near Moscow, killing 145. Then in June, a church and a synagogue in Russia's Dagestan province were attacked, leaving approximately 30 dead. To cap the year off, on New Year's Eve, Shamsuddin Jabbar drove a pickup truck into a crowd on Bourbon Street in New Orleans and killed 14 people before being shot dead by police. Jabbar, a born and raised Texan and Army veteran, recorded videos in the hours before his attack, pledging allegiance to ISIS. So those are just a few major ones in the last year. And of course, this follows, I think, what was sort of announced to be and sort of a mission accomplished kind of air, following the group's territorial collapse in 2017. They no longer control a so-called caliphate the size of Britain through Iraq and Syria, but they still pose quite a considerable threat. So I wanted to discuss that a bit. Following its territorial defeat on the ground, ISIS has undergone significant organizational restructuring. How does this new structure, particularly the role of its General Directorate of Provinces, which I know you've written a lot about, differ from the more decentralized franchise model of Al-Qaeda? And what are the implications of this shift for their operational coherence and global strategy?
Yeah, it's an important body within the Islamic State to understand, to really get why it's been able to be involved in so many of these external operations in recent years. We saw starting in, with the fall of their territory in Iraq and Syria, that they were reorganizing themselves, where at the time in Iraq and Syria, they had dozens of different provinces internally in those places, and they kind of just put them into one Syria province, one Iraq province. And part of that process was that they then created this general director of provinces, which in many ways helped establish more integration amongst its global networks than they had previously. Of course, they announced that they had these external provinces going back to the fall of 2014. And they did send operatives to these locations so that they would follow sort of the methodologies of what the Islamic State was doing in Iraq and Syria. And there were some successes, especially in the case of Libya, short lived though, since they lost the territory there after a year or two. But overall, many of these groups more or less still continue to remain remnants of older insurgencies, or just didn't have the footing maybe to be able to follow exactly what the Islamic State was trying to do, as they had been in Iraq and Syria. And with the general director of provinces, it created this body where you had senior figures from all the provinces now really all connected to one another all of the time, in constant contact. And you also saw movement of recruits and money between the provinces in a way that really hadn't been seen before. And so, one of the key parts of this is that Abdul Qadir Mu'min, who's a Somali ISIS leader, became the head of the general director of provinces. In some ways, an important point, because historically most of the leaders of IS have been Iraqis or Syrians. So the fact that somebody in this body, which is essentially a body right under the Caliph and the Majlis al-Shura positions, has the key role of managing the whole network more or less on a day-to-day basis, just because the Caliph has to kind of hide, and also is more, a symbolic religious leader, political leader, military leader, but not necessarily telling people what to do on a day-to-day basis. But because of that, Somalia has become this key node in the broader global IS network, in terms of the movement of recruits via Somalia into other parts of Africa, or the movement of money, because they don't have a ton of fighters within IS in Somalia. And so the type of illicit activity that they're involved with locally, they're able to send that money to other IS provinces, especially the ones in sub-Saharan Africa and Mozambique and in Democratic Republic of Congo. And two, beyond just sort of movement of recruits and financial networks, these hubs, especially in Somalia, but also you see in Turkey as well, they're sort of in between the theaters in Africa and Europe, the Caucasus, the Middle East, South Asia, and therefore there's these in between spaces in some regards, globally, that allows the different spheres of the world to connect to one another in a way that might have been more difficult when you're just considering Iraq and Syria, which are harder to move through in some ways. And that's why Turkey has become this key way station for a lot of these networks as well within the general directorate of provinces. I mean, you saw the attacks in Russia. There was also some plots in Germany, as well as some other cases where before people did the attacks or attempted to do a plot that was broken up, they went back to Turkey ahead of time to sort of get final instructions from like a handler. So essentially, they have this whole network of people assisting on this front. And so while a lot of these plots and attacks that people have talked about in the last year or two being attributed to like the Islamic State's Khorasan province in Afghanistan, ISKP, it's much broader than that when you actually dig down into some of these attacks and plots, where you have components of it being funded, say, by IS in Somalia. You have recruitment by ISKP online and maybe sending, cryptocurrencies online from ISKP folks, but also you have handlers based in Turkey, and then informants in other locations as well with fake documentation so people can move through different areas more easily. And a lot of this is being coordinated essentially through this general directorate of provinces. And in many ways, that's why they've been successful in a lot of these attacks, as well as just having more plots in general, because you can't just go after one province per se and whack the mole. that has happened, in the past when we talk about these issues. Like, when we saw all those attacks like a decade ago coming from IS in Syria, it was mainly just coming from IS in Syria. Obviously, there are a couple that came from IS in Libya, but for the most part, if once they started doing the global campaign against IS in Syria as well as Iraq, once it happened, you stopped really seeing a lot of these plots and attacks. Another aspect of this too is that I think is important and crucial for this is the role of encrypted applications. Obviously, we know governments can break these types of things, but if they don't know who is doing it or who's involved in these types of communications ahead of time, there's no leakage of information, then it's much more easy for people to communicate in a way that's hidden now than maybe even 5 to 10 years ago as well. Because a decade ago, a lot of we did see, of course, inspired attacks, but a lot of them were also directed from the territories where people would train in the locales of the war zones and then go back home or in a third country to do an attack. Whereas now much of it is continues to be inspired, but also this middle model, the guided model, where they're able to talk to people through encrypted applications and provide instructions, making sure people stick to the plan and things along those lines. And that makes it a bit more difficult too, especially if law enforcement intelligence isn't aware of the particular people messaging, because then even if they might be able to crack it, in that case they wouldn't be able to because they don't know who's involved in it.
Who's thought to be their overall leader right now?
It's the same guys they announced a few years ago, this Abu Hafs al-Hashimi al-Qurashi. That hasn't changed. We still, at least in the public domain, have no idea who that actually is. No idea where he actually is based. I mean, most people assume that he continues to be based in Syria, as the previous IS leaders were the main other people that were killed in succession to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. But they haven't put out any audio messages from him once, which has been interesting as well. And it's now been maybe a couple of years since he took power. But yeah, and that's why somebody like Abdul Qadir Mutman has also become so important, because people actually know who he is, and he's the one directing a lot of the management. So even if he's not the actual caliph, a lot of power within the organization derives from him, because he's managing a lot of these networks within the broader Islamic State system.
It's interesting because Baghdadi was such in his heyday back, between 2014, 2016, was such a kind of public facing figurehead for the organization in this almost sort of, I guess you could say, arrogant way, like crowning himself the caliph in Mosul, at the mosque in Mosul. Is that, you think, more of a deliberate strategy now to keep their leaders sort of like totally off the front pages, so to speak?
I mean, I think it's a continuation of what we've seen in the past. It is true that we did see Baghdadi's face and he had the speech at Mosul, but besides that, he only had one other video where he actually was on video, and it was like 6 months before he was killed, I think in April 2019. All of the other releases that he did in sort of the 9 years he was in charge of the group, was an audio message form, and they weren't that often either. I mean, they're maybe once or twice a year at most. So it's not really different than sort of what we've seen in the recent past from the group. Similar things happen with a couple of other caliphs that came into power after Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed, and then before they were killed themselves, of course. And part of it is because they have more of this like legalistic model of leadership, where it doesn't really matter who the person is in charge. It's really about sort of the ideology and continuing the fight in the path of their worldview and trying to implement it on the ground globally. Whereas, say, on the other hand, Al-Qaeda, very much a charismatic model where you'd have all these videos from bin Laden, but you'd also have videos from other key ideologues all the time. And once many of them were killed, that sort of began the process of them being in terminal decline in many ways, because, Ayman al-Zawahiri never was able to fill that charismatic role that bin Laden had.
Yeah.
I mean, he also had other issues too in terms of strategy, and also just people didn't necessarily like his personality. But because of that, for the Islamic State, a lot of it is just about, keeping calm and carrying on for their perspective. And it doesn't really matter who the caliph is, so long as there is this caliph figure, people pledge, allegiance, and that's that, and they continue to work on their project.
From an organizational standpoint, is that what I think you're describing here, that balance of centralized coordination and regional autonomy, does that expose any vulnerabilities that could be exploited by counterterrorism efforts?
I mean, it's a good question. It's hard to say. I mean, one of the things people have been curious about over the years is whether, because the core or the original core in like Iraq and Syria has gotten weakened, if different groups might try and break away in the same way we saw more fractures within Al Qaeda's networks once Bin Laden was killed, but also the large scale drone campaign against much of the senior leadership in the AfPak region over the years from like around 2008 to 2012, 2013 time period. And so far, we really haven't been able to see these cracks in this foundation in the same way. It's important to note, though, that even though there was a split between ISIS and Al Qaeda now more than a decade ago, most of the OG Al Qaeda branches remain with Al Qaeda. So even if there have been issues within Al Qaeda, and of course you did see the Islamic State as well as HTS break away from them, all of the other main ones have remained with them. So it's clear that there's a lot of discipline and adherence to leadership instructions and messaging by a lot of these groups, just because of the way that this worldview is in many respects. So while there could be a potential for it, there really hasn't been any signs of it at all.
ISIS has strategically expanded into regions like Central Asia, Somalia, Sub-Saharan Africa. What makes these regions fertile ground for their operations, and how have local dynamics there influenced their strategies?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it depends on the particular spaces you're talking about. A lot of the areas, say in the Sahel region, like West Africa, they've been able to take advantage of the fact that there have been all of these Russian-sponsored coups, and the Russians mainly have been involved in sort of protecting the regime than it really being truly counterterrorism. In the same way we saw in Syria, before the regime fell, where a lot of it was about regime protection than it was against actually going after jihadists. Of course, in this space, you also have Al Qaeda's main branch there, Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam al-Muslimin, or JNIM. And both of those groups have been able to take advantage of this because these regimes just do not have the capabilities to take on the jihadists, especially once they're being sponsored with Russia, which is less focused on that aspect of it than, say, when the French and the US were actually providing good intelligence and also not creating massacres that led to more grievances and more people then joining up with either JNIM or ISIS. In Somalia, they've been able to take advantage of primarily being based in one of the autonomous zones in Somalia, in the Puntland regions, and therefore farther away from, say, Al Shabaab, which is Al Qaeda's branch there and a rival, because Al Shabaab is a much stronger actor. And so they've been able to carve out their own territory and be able to take advantage of that. Interestingly enough, we've seen for the first time that the Puntland regional government's starting to do an offensive against the Islamic State there, which, if they were to be successful, obviously big if, it could severely undermine a lot of IS's operations, not only in Somalia, but also broadly speaking in its global network, because, as I said, a lot of the power within the General Directorate of Provinces is based in Somalia now with Abdul Qadir movement, and the fact that a lot of money moves through it to Turkey, to Afghanistan, as well as onto Southern Africa and the DRC and Mozambique regions. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out and how that could then not only affect IS in Somalia itself, but the whole broader network and how they might react to that. But again, that's a big if. And then in terms of the issue of Central Asians, I mean, a lot of this mobilization isn't really happening within those countries itself. It's there's this whole thing about like all these Tajiks being involved in a lot of these attacks or plots. It's not really happening within Tajikistan. A lot of this is happening from Tajiks based abroad, whether in Iran, Turkey, Russia, Europe. They're, migrant workers. They don't necessarily feel like they're integrated into the societies, but also kind of feel alienated from their home country because of the way that the governments operate there. And therefore, the Islamic State has been able to fill this gap for them and providing this sort of new identity for them and to provide some significance in their life beyond just being like a menial type of worker in some foreign land. And so they've been able to take advantage of that through their recruitment networks, especially via the Islamic State's Khorasan province in Afghanistan, by building up this whole network of propaganda in different languages, including in Tajik, in Uzbek, in other, in Russian and other languages, to sort of connect these older foreign fighter networks that had been involved in Afghanistan previously, or even remnant ones from Syria that have kind of hung out in Turkey, and connecting to these, networks of individuals that have, personal grievances, and then taking advantage of it. And we've seen the consequences of it now in recent years. It seems like, in the last maybe 2 or 3 months of the year, the pace of things started to go down a little bit. I think part of it is that law enforcement intelligence finally started to catch up to this phenomenon that was building over the previous 2 years or so. But I think this year in 2025 will really give us an indication of whether that's continuing to go down, or the last 2 months of the year or so is just like a blip and it'll remain the same, or if it'll continue to go up.
Yeah, I want to stay with ISIS-K here for a second. So that's their Khorasan province, so Central Asia. They were the group that was responsible for the big Moscow attack in March. U.S. officials have indicated that that's the part of the group that really concerns them, at least for a homeland threat standpoint, I guess. Why is that branch so active and seen by officials as a greater threat than the others?
I mean, a lot of it has to do with the fact that probably, I don't know, maybe 2/3 or so of the external plots and attacks that we've seen over the last year or two have emanated or have been related to ISKP. Though I think it is important to note that we have seen some of these plots have aspects of coordination between ISKP and IS in Syria and IS in Turkey and IS in Somalia as well. So even though it's kind of the face of it, they're not the only ones involved in it. And it's interesting because they've actually been degraded within Afghanistan. Like, since the US left and the Taliban took over, the amount of attacks in Afghanistan has gone down by 95%. And so it's not necessarily like a day-to-day issue in Afghanistan. And a lot of it goes back to what I said before in terms of them being able to parlay a lot of these propaganda communication networks and taking advantage of encrypted applications to recruit people abroad. I mean, we saw last year in 2024 that two of the attack plots that happened, that were broken up by, the FBI, local law enforcement, were related to ISKP. And a lot of it has to do with people just being in communication online with these operatives. And that's what makes this more complicated in some ways than in the past, where even if, say, the US, for whatever reason, started doing airstrikes in Afghanistan, it wouldn't necessarily stop external operations, because you don't necessarily need to be in a particular place to do this type of things now. I mean, somebody could be literally living in like Idaho and talking to somebody else somewhere else in the world and tell them to go do an attack and provide them with guidance and instructions, and they can do it. So like, it makes it that much more complicated in some ways than just if somebody has like an address and territorial control. It should be caveated that although it is true that many of the IS related plots and attacks that we saw in the last year were ISKP related, five other IS provinces were also involved in external operations plots and attacks as well, which is unprecedented. I mean, a decade ago, like I said, is primarily IS in Syria, couple things here and there from IS in Libya, but at one time or another, there's usually just one province or so at the time. But last year, 6 IS provinces were involved in external operations planning and plotting, with IS in Pakistan, IS in Iraq, IS in Syria, Turkey, Somalia, as well as IS in Yemen. If you'll recall, one of the other larger attacks this year was the one in Oman, and that was related, or I should say last year now, 2024, was related to IS in Yemen. And then, of course, there was like a small attack at the beginning of 2024 in early January in Turkey as well. So while it is crucial definitely to pay attention to ISKP, I also think it's important to identify that it's not just ISKP that's involved in these external operations. And that's why I think understanding the General Directorate of Provinces is so crucial too, because it is this coordination amongst all of them. So while there might be certain faces of provinces for particular plots, there is this coordination amongst them beyond it just being one province in a lot of cases too.
So the sudden, unexpected fall of Assad's regime in Syria has created a power vacuum, if even temporarily. How likely is it that IS will exploit that vacuum to reestablish a significant foothold? And what would that resurgence look like in, like, what are you expecting, I guess, over the course of the next year or so?
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, so far, we're almost a month since the fall of the Assad regime. We haven't seen the Islamic State being able to take advantage of it. Part of it is due to the fact that the global coalition against ISIS remains based in northeast Syria, and so they've continued to conduct, operations against cells in the eastern part of the country as they have been doing the last, 10 plus years now. But also, something that we saw earlier this past fall was that CENTCOM started doing airstrikes in central Syria as well. At the time, Assad regime territory, because they were pissed off that the regime and the Russians weren't dealing with ISIS there, because in many ways ISIS was stronger in central Syria than they were in eastern Syria. But now, because the regime is gone, they've been able to unload all the intelligence that they've had in a larger manner and done a bunch of airstrikes, large scale airstrikes that have killed hundreds of ISIS operatives and broken up training camps. And also, one of the forces that the U.S. has been working with has also taken over the central city of Palmyra. So they not only have sort of this hub in sort of the eastern part of the country through the Syrian Democratic Forces, but also through the Syrian Free Army, which was based in the Tanf garrison, sort of at the border area between Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. Now they've moved into central Syria and Palmyra to try and avert anything from happening. I think that's part of the reason why we really haven't seen anything beyond sort of the trend line that we had been seeing previously with IS in Syria. And, one of the things that I was looking for was whether we would see spontaneous IS attacks during Christmas Eve or on Christmas against minority communities, Christians within Syria. We did not see that, thankfully. And then also the potential for attacks on celebrations related to New Year's Eve. Unfortunately, we saw something like that in the US, but in Syria, we did not. So those are all positive things. I still worry that in sort of the few days after the fall of the regime, IS might have moved operatives from central Syria into some cities and set up cells and are waiting to try and do attacks. Thus far, we have not seen this, thankfully, but it is something that I'm looking out for and worrying about potentially. The biggest worry, though, is the fact that there continues to be 9,000 male ISIS prisoners based in northeast Syria, run by the SDF, and the SDF has been having to fight against the Turkish proxy, the Syrian National Army. And so the worry is if, for whatever reason, the SDF loses the territory or they have to focus more of their resources on the fight with Turkey's proxies, then there could be greater opportunity that the Islamic State could try and break these people out of prison. We already saw them trying to do this back in 2 or 3 years ago now in the Hussein prison in Hasaka city. Some people got out. Many were found and brought back, but others escaped. And so, when we think about a resurgence for the Islamic State, if it did happen, that's where it would come from. People being released from prison that are hardened individuals that were involved in the creation of sort of that caliphate project 10 years ago, and they would be back out onto the streets essentially. And if people remember, there was the Breaking the Walls prison break campaign that we saw from the Islamic State back in like 2013-14 time period and lead up to the takeover of Mosul in Iraq. And at most, there was maybe like up to 1,500 people that were let out of prisons then. And we saw the kind of chaos and how ISIS was able to parlay that into victories within Iraq, but then also back into Syria as well. We're talking about 9,000 people, and that doesn't even get into all of the women and children that were previously associated with the Islamic State through marriage or through people being born that are based at the IDP camps too. Obviously, they wouldn't necessarily be involved in fighting per se, but it would assist with building back up that sort of state building project too. And so for me, that's still the biggest question mark. And I think that, the U.S. and Turkey really need to be careful with this fighting between the two groups that they're both backing, because in many ways, it's playing with fire that Turkey continues to back these forces that could totally undermine and destabilize not only Syria, but also Iraq, but also Turkey itself, as well as, global security too, because we know what emanated from IS in Syria a decade ago. These aren't just Iraqis and Syrians in these prisons that were with ISIS either, but also foreigners too, including many people from the West as well. And so I think that, unless there's a long-term solution to this, there's always going to be this, issue in the back of people's mind that could lead to ISIS being able to break these people out. And therefore, we're back at square one from, maybe not a decade ago, but from around 2016, 17 time period, when ISIS was starting to lose its territory. It was more of an insurgency by then.
Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back with more. So you've been posting an almost, I think, daily chronicle of HTS, this Islamist Confederation of Militias that now governs Syria. You posted this almost like daily chronicle of their efforts to build a cohesive, functioning governance. Really fascinating stuff. I'll post a link to it in the show notes. In the event that, let's say Turkey intervenes in a more aggressive way, or the incoming U.S. administration says, we're not here for this in Syria anymore. We're packing up and we're going home. Do you think HTS is willing and capable to handle the IS threat there on their own?
I think they're definitely willing. The question is more whether they have the capacity to do that. When they were only controlling northwest Syria, they took down all of the ISIS cells in that region, as well as Al-Qaeda cells for that matter. But again, that was only in a small area of the country. Now they're not only trying to scale everything up related to governance, but also security. And they're also dealing with remnants of the former regime being involved in violence and also trying to undermine the security of the country now. And so, one of the questions going forward is what kind of deal can be cut between HTS and SDF so that there's a smooth transition, because that northeastern part of the country still is outside of the control of HTS. HTS pretty much controls most of the country except for parts of Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, and all of Hasaka region. And so that's one of the biggest questions going forward, as well as what that could mean for the global coalition as well. It's hard to say right now. There have been discussions between the two of them, but HTS views itself as the ones that overthrew the regime. They want to have a monopoly on violence in Syria, like any government would when they're the ruling entity, essentially. But of course, the SDF, which is majority Kurd, worries about being able to defend themselves against any threats, whether local or outside of Syria, because of the fact that Turkey views the SDF as a branch of the PKK, which is a foreign terrorist organization by the U.S. government. And it's true that there are elements within the SDF that have been associated with the PKK, but saying the SDF is just a wholly PKK branch is not completely correct. And so there's a lot of complications related to that. And while it's true that Turkey has pushed this idea that they could be the ones in control of fighting ISIS or in control of the prisons and IDP camps, or that HTS could do it, it's just very risky proposition, since there's no history of something along these lines. And I think the U.S. would be uncomfortable in any situation related to that, just because it has massive security concerns, not just for Syria, but the global community. And putting that on a new government that's trying to consolidate control over so many parts of the country is a tall order. And so, I think that there needs to be some phased transition where that could eventually happen. But in the near term, I think it would be a terrible idea. Obviously, I think we understand that the instincts of Trump in many ways is to leave Syria, as we saw in his first administration. But I think it would be a massive mistake, and that there could be monumental security consequences globally for it. And I think it would be regretted at some point too if that happened.
I think you sort of were touching on this just now, but my next question I wanted to ask, reflecting on the policy decisions of the last 3 administrations, we'll say, that sort of brought us here, are there any lessons that you think the U.S. and its Western allies should heed to avoid the mistakes that enabled IS's initial rise? I mean, it seems you're very clear that we need to have some sort of presence remaining in Syria for the foreseeable future. Anything else you think, big missteps in the past that we should seek to avoid again?
I think it's also important to contextualize that, yes, the U.S. is in Syria, but we shouldn't be thinking about this in the context of the U.S. invading Iraq in 2003 or Afghanistan in 2001. There's only 900 American troops there, and they're not on the front lines fighting. They're providing train and assist mostly, and an ISR more or less. And I think that is important to remember, because the way it's sometimes talked about more in the political class, as well as those that are activist types about forever war, quote unquote, type things, is that everything is the same as the 2003 invasion, when there's this spectrum of military activity. If you look at what the U.S. has done in Syria vis-a-vis the campaign against ISIS, it's the best bang for its buck. In many ways, it's on par with, say, the campaign in the original Gulf War, when the U.S. saved Kuwait from Iraq, where it was this is the pinnacle of the end of the Cold War, essentially, where this is in many ways the pinnacle of the 9/11 era in many ways. Obviously, I would argue we're in many ways post that era now because of the focus on China, Russia, etc. But this is sort of like the perfect example of what probably should have been done after 2001, but it finally happened between 2014 and the present, and therefore, so long as there isn't a stable situation in Syria, or there needs to be this transition away from it once HTS and whatever government forms there happens, it's a key to remain there. And besides that, I think, continued law enforcement intelligence sharing, I think that's gotten better and better over the years. It's part of the reason why many of these plots by IS have not succeeded recently. Obviously, unfortunately, there was this attack in New Orleans, and there was a stabbing attack in Germany this past summer in Solingen. But overall, within the Western context at least, ISIS is at a very difficult time actually succeeding in doing attacks. They still have been plotting a lot, but they haven't succeeded because of this intelligence sharing and law enforcement coordination amongst many, Western nations. It's important to recall that the U.S. actually warned both Iran and Russia about the attacks that happened last year by
Yeah.
ISKP, and if they actually heeded those warnings, it's likely that they wouldn't have actually happened. And I think there might have been a different perception on how we might look at the threat from IS external operations as well if they didn't occur too. So that's an important aspect to think about. And then, special operations too. Like I think that it's important that within sort of the government sector that we maintain the enough resources in terms of budgets, but also personnel to track these threats, because they do take advantage of any seam within any location in society, whether to start a terrorism campaign or an insurgency, and then external operations. But I think we've kind of figured out, broadly speaking, the best way to manage this issue in terms of alliance building, intelligence, law enforcement, collaboration and sharing, special operations, and then where needed, sort of boots on the ground. But boots on the ground in a way that you're not like occupying a country, but more working with local forces to force multiply them in some ways to do this. And I think we've gotten overall to a pretty good spot, while still trying to also deal with other security threats globally, as I alluded to before, with China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, whatever else.
When you ask counterterrorism experts, what leads to someone becoming radicalized, the answer to that is so often just very nebulous and I think subjective to the person that you're talking about. So looking at this guy behind the New Orleans attack, born and raised Texan in the military, had a six-figure job working for Deloitte. However, was on his third divorce, I believe, deeply in debt, right? So if you look at, I think, on one's road to radicalization, at the point where that radicalization mobilizes itself to violence, the reasons behind that mobilization to violence, I think, are often have very little to do with the ideologies that you're claiming to do this for, right? Like if you want to unsubscribe from your life because it's falling apart around you, what better way to, at least in your head, think that there's some sort of greater meaning behind this than to look into your phone on your way to Bourbon Street and pledge allegiance to ISIS? I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely truth to these statements. He obviously, I think, was looking at Islamic State content and propaganda prior to that, of course, too. But there's this saying from security officials in like Belgium, like back like a decade ago, when many people started seeing all this recruitment for ISIS to become foreign fighters, for people to have essentially these lives where they go from like zero to a hero. Obviously, this is all in their minds and based off of this worldview of the Islamic State, not necessarily how obviously the two of us might look at it. But essentially, it's a way for people to make some level of significance for themselves in their own life and make it seem like they're their own hero in their own story on some level. And you see, like with this guy in particular, usually a lot of these types of issues happen when there's some problem in somebody's life and they don't necessarily know how to deal with it or pivot. Of course, there's people globally that have problems all the time, and that's not why we necessarily see every single person ever getting involved in extremism, radicalism, terrorism, what have you. But a small subset of people, within psychology, they call this cognitive opening, where you're more open to ideas that maybe in a normal situation you wouldn't be, and therefore they latch onto that to provide this meaning. So you do see this when people, have like divorce issues, or maybe somebody dies in a family, or some level of economic problems. Not to say that those are the explanatory reasons why people become jihadists, for example, just because we see people getting involved from literally all walks of lives. There is no profile for somebody that gets involved with an Islamic State or an Al Qaeda. But when you do have those issues in your life, it could for some provide this opening where you're more exposed to, or maybe willing to take on ideas that maybe if your life was a bit more stable, or you're in a better mental space, you likely wouldn't have potentially taken on. And then there's also sometimes identity issues as well, especially for people that are maybe immigrants in more of like a Western context than say somebody in like a Muslim majority context. We're just talking about jihadis, where say somebody from like their parents went from Algeria to France like 30 or 40 years ago. They grew up in France. They don't necessarily feel completely French because of the discrimination or maybe potential racism or maybe the way people treat them. But they also don't necessarily feel completely like Algerian anymore either, because they didn't grow up in Algeria and therefore are seen a foreigner in their parents' homeland when they might go there as well. And therefore, a group like the Islamic State or in the past Al Qaeda, they're like, well, you don't have to be either of these. You can just be a Muslim. And therefore, you should do this on behalf of God. And that then provides you with this identity where you can strongly latch onto from their perspective that then pursues the goals and mission of, say, an Islamic State. So there's sort of like that whole aspect of it. And then you add on to that all of the ideological reasoning, and the ideological reasoning then helps justify and mobilize action in some ways as well.
So in our current bewildering and often very dumb age of online extremism and deep political polarization, how has the internet served as both a breeding ground and accelerant for IS-inspired radicalization within the U.S.? Do you think the information environment will make this worse going forward?
Well, I think that for a time period, it was actually getting better, because by 2014, 2015, most technology companies realized that you can't just have unfettered information online, because then anybody could be exposed to stuff. And there's also no lines on what's considered legitimate or not. Or ones that could incite violence or recruit people to violence, for that matter. However, in the last couple of years, obviously, we've seen that there's sort of been a pushback against this, because some people, they don't necessarily view it in the context of like jihadis and terrorism, but more like censorship of more normalized political speech. But because of that, there's these consequences then for extremist and terrorist movements, where this more libertarian view on things, as we've seen since Elon Musk has taken over Twitter/X, and now sort of what we've heard more recently from, say, Meta/Facebook, and then kind of opening the floodgates again, that groups like the Islamic State will be able to take advantage of this, even if maybe the reason for why these companies are doing this is their version of a backlash against sort of the woke politics and all of that type of thing. But you can't but just because you're only narrowly focused on that doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to have effects in other parts of the world, in other ideologies and other issues. And what we've seen is that that Islamic State supporters have once again been able to repopulate platforms, the big platforms like Facebook and X now, in a way we really haven't seen since 2015. It's not at the same scale as it was a decade ago, so I don't want to make it a bigger deal than it is. But it's no longer that you don't see them on there and they're not recruiting people or harassing people. It's not at the same level, but it's definitely concerning that they're taking advantage of these opening capabilities, and there's less of the sort of trust and safety, as it's called in the industry, within the tech industry, related to making sure those types of actors are not able to expose themselves to just random users, and therefore potentially lead to more people getting involved in this type of activity.
Yeah. So we're now a decade more than that, out from 2014, which is insane to think of. But feels like it was yesterday. Have you seen any signs of like a generation of people who are being exposed to this content online, younger people who perhaps don't have a living memory like we do of the beheadings, the people being set on fire in cages, the Yazidis, being almost driven to extinction, that kind of, don't have that context of like what they're actually getting behind?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, one of the things that the Islamic State has been able to do in its propaganda is sort of, in the past, before that they built this state, a lot of what ISIS and Al Qaeda did was create this, utopian narrative about, the beginnings of Islam and that they needed to go back just to the seventh century. And if they followed that, then everything would be perfect, obviously. Um,
Hmm.
but now they don't have to, at least the Islamic State in particular, doesn't need to rely upon this utopian narrative, but now it's just about nostalgia because they can be like, "Hey, we did this. We restarted the caliphate. We had this thing going. If it wasn't for all these damn apostates and infidels, we'd still be doing this." And they're not going to point to like all this grisly violence, even though for some people they are into that, and that's part of the reason why they got involved in ISIS because they're a bit sadistic. But for others, is a lot of it, was this state building project in many ways, and therefore they can point to sort of this. Aspect of this governance project and to be like, this is what we were doing. Like we were totally fine. We were living as quote unquote Muslims, and life was good. It wasn't all these outside actors ruining our state, even though they don't get into the fact that they're literally having a war against everybody in the world, literally.
Yeah.
And so you definitely see some of this. Obviously, I briefly talked about Facebook and Twitter or X in this in some ways more of the U.S. context, but we've also seen them taking advantage of the algorithms on TikTok where it's even more viral in some ways because it's like these really short clips and interspersing the anashid, the music in them, and therefore grabbing this even younger audience. And that's one of the things that we've actually noticed in the last couple of years is that increasingly people getting arrested for IS related stuff, especially in Western countries. Well, there's definitely people that have gotten involved, that are older. Obviously, this attacker in New Orleans was like 40 something, but on an unprecedented level, we're seeing people from the ages of 12 to 16 getting involved in this type of activity online or potentially trying to plot something, which really wasn't the case a decade ago. And that's very worrisome because, these little kids, they don't know any better. And they also
Hmm.
don't even have any context in this. And they probably just, think it's something that's just fun and silly because they're so young. And I mean, I'm sure both of us did dumb things when we were kids too. Obviously, it wasn't joining up with ISIS or a jihadist group.
I didn't talk to Al Qaeda
Yeah,
in middle
exactly.
school.
But
Did
but
not.
but 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 for a certain segment of
Yes.
people, this is their dumb mistake. Obviously, it sounds absurd saying it, but it is true. Instead of like getting involved in like drugs or like I don't know, you know what I mean. But like it's just a reality, and then dealing with that issue from like a policy perspective is that much more difficult just because of all the privacy laws related to people under 18 and also like what do you do about jailing somebody yet young and the fact that while it is true that there's been all these discussions about having off ramps and more social services and like healthcare workers or like mental health professionals involved in type of this stuff so that it doesn't get to a certain level because so much of it is securitized but like where then it just gets really complicated when you start talking about like a 12, 13, 14-year old kid getting involved in these types of things. It's really it's definitely a difficult challenge for sure.
Just to, as we wrap up here, as the U.S. juggles multiple global threats, what specific counterterrorism strategies should the military and intelligence community refine or adopt to effectively address IS in its current form? So, is it? I mean, yeah, we've talked about the continued footprint in Syria. Is it more of a over the horizon JSOC strikes into Central Asia? So, like, how do we strike a balance between not allowing IS to fester while still being able to address these other more existential geopolitical rivals like Russia and China?
I think in many ways, for the most part, there has been some level of right sizing over the last 4 or 5 years or so, where it is primarily focused on intelligence sharing and law enforcement locally. It is, drone strikes when necessary. You do still have some boots on the ground here and there in places like Syria, but also, in Somalia and some other locations, I imagine that maybe aren't disclosed publicly.
Hmm.
But we also have to understand that there's some limitations and risks to it as well, just because the US can't do this all everywhere necessarily, especially when we're in this era of power competition. So, for example, like I was alluding to before, with the Russians more or less taking over the quote unquote counterterrorism space in the Sahel region, West Africa, like the US is going to start a war with Russia over counterterrorism in that area. And so, like, even if the US would want to do more in Mali, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, whatever, there's a limitation on what they can actually do, and you have to kind of live with that reality, just because the Russians are taking advantage of some of those types of things. And then in the case of, say, Afghanistan, like, obviously, people in the U.S. are skeptical of the Taliban, which makes total sense. But they do get more diplomatic cover by the Chinas of the world, and therefore, if the U.S. wanted to do something like they did right after the Taliban took over with the drone strike against Ayman al-Zawahiri and Al-Qaeda, the more time goes on, it's probably likely more difficult to do something along those lines, just because China is so invested in Afghanistan now. And so, I think a lot of it is making sure the core areas where the U.S. maintains a lot of these presences and fighting capabilities, they don't just cede it in the way that could happen if the U.S. left Syria, for example, but also working at the edges to try and make sure it doesn't spread. And it's part of the reason why the U.S. has developed more relations with countries surrounding sort of the Sahel region, more in the Gulf of Guinea, like the Ivory Coast, Benin, Togo, Ghana, Senegal, etc. To try and make sure it doesn't continue to spread. Obviously, easier said than done when Russia's making the situation way worse in the way that it's conducting itself in these countries, as well as the way that the local governments are conducting it too. But overall, if the U.S. can continue to do this, and then hopefully maybe showcase down the line that, look, the Russians aren't really actually helping with this. This has actually gotten worse. I mean, the level of violence in the Sahel has gotten 4 times worse. Maybe the U.S. and France can go back in to help out, and obviously it would be a lot more difficult now because the jihadi groups have spread out. But I think overall we're in a relatively good space, considering the fact that there's also these big elephants in the room of Russia and China.
Anything else you'd like to add or cover that we haven't yet today?
I mean, I think the main thing is that although a group like the Islamic State or jihadis in general may be not the top news story anymore, like they were post 9/11 or post ISIS takeover of Iraq and Syria, when we have events like what happened in New Orleans, it's not as if these types of actions just come out of nowhere. The group has continued to operate. People saying that they're quote unquote defeated is just incorrect. The threat just looks different now than it did 5, 6, 10 years ago. And it manifests differently, but they still do have insurgencies in eastern Syria, central Syria, smaller terrorism campaign in Iraq, as well as all of the growing insurgent activity in Africa, and then the external operations coming from Afghanistan. And so even if it's not touching people's lives in terms of what they're seeing every day, the Islamic State is still working towards its goals. So, if something happens, it's all because this continues to happen globally, even if it's maybe not affecting daily life in the same way that it had been maybe 20 years ago or 10 years ago, for that matter.
I guess just to that point, and what we were talking about here a second ago, I think in the context of the New Orleans attack, I think the trend of tech companies now very quickly running in the opposite direction on content moderation, it's good to keep in mind there are second and third order consequences of those decisions that I don't think intended when they made those decisions. I think that's definitely something to keep an eye on in the next few years.
Yeah, especially as things become more encrypted and harder to potentially track. So we might see sort of, a tale of this maybe in 2 to 5 years, where while the insurgencies and things abroad might say the same, or maybe even the Islamic State does worse, but in terms of being able to inspire or guide attacks abroad, those could remain higher than what has been, sort of the average previously, just because people are able to get access to propaganda or recruiters in a way that maybe was impossible between 2015 to maybe in the last year or so.
Aaron, where can listeners find more about you and your work?
You can follow me on Twitter/X at Zelin, or on Blue Sky, same username. Of course, I've got both my regular jihadology.net website, which is mainly just propaganda, and then Jihadology Plus, which is more a Substack.
I just want to say you're posting jihadi propaganda on there for to review academically. Your stuff you're not saying is propaganda.
Yes, exactly. Sorry. And you also need to like register on Jihadology too. It's not like
Yeah.
I'm just letting this open to the world. And
Right.
then, of course, I write or work for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, so all my writings are there, and I'm always open for people to contact me. So look forward to seeing people online.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that and everything today. I would love to have you back on in the near future if you're down for it to talk about HTS in Syria. There's a lot to cover there.
Yeah, it's a whole nother discussion. It's very
Uh-huh.
interesting and complicated, but for somebody that's focused on the group for many of years, it's very interesting, from a research perspective. So
Yeah, I was talking to Philip Smythe, who we're both friends with, and he was saying to be alive and writing and studying the Middle East right now is really just incredible.
yeah, I mean, what's happening now in many ways is like something that happens, every like 2 generations or so. It's like a once in 60 year type of thing. So
Yep. It's like the 70s again.
yeah. So hoping for the best though. So we'll see, inshallah.
Yes, inshallah. All right. Well, thank you so much, sir. It's good to have you on.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me again.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.